Hi investors, Nick Garner here for Invest More, and today we're going to do a review of a place called Moston. Now, if you've heard of it, it's probably bad things because it's notorious for crime. Anyhow, one of my community asked for a review, and I'm as intrigued as anyone because I think it'll be very interesting to see how it all comes out in the washing, as it were. All right, then, let's get into it. Here we've got the variables sheet, and the idea is that give each variable a score out of 5, and then I have a weighting for each variable, and then it ends up with a final number. And generally speaking, I think the number is reasonably accurate, certainly based on feedback and other analysis we've done. Let's get into the location first. And Moston is interesting in that it is very close to central Manchester. We're talking like 4.5K. It's from a driving point of view, it's 15 minutes, public transport, 20 minutes. It's excellent in that respect. The other thing about location is whether it's got like good amenities or not. And we can see here that overall there's lots of green space in this area. And it's also got a central area, I think some industrial, and also things like a Lidl and other shopping facilities. It's got the railway, of course, which we saw earlier. So overall, this is a good location in my opinion, and I'm going to give it a 4 on that. Now the next one is demographic, and this is a big topic. What I'll do is I'll start with the very high level stuff and I'll work my way down. The first thing with Moston is its social grade. Now, if you've seen other videos, you'll know I talk a lot about social grade C1 as being the optimal group for renting, and the reason is because they have not enough money to buy their own property, but enough money to have reasonable disposable income, secure jobs, and thus make good, solid tenants. And we can see here, for example, Droylsden, an area that I really like, has plenty of C1. Moston, not so much so. And if we look at social rented, we can see in Droylsden, not so much social rented, and a lot of socially rented property here. Now, socially rented isn't an issue per se, but it does correlate with with a lack of stock for sale and for rent, and also it tends to be that social C1 people tend not to like to live in areas with high proportions of social housing. Therefore, that's potentially an issue. The other question is whether they're economically active. And you can see here in Droylsden, once again, it's economically, it's very solid, plenty of people working, but you can see here in the Moston area, less people working. So therefore, on those fronts, it's not looking great. I'm going to show you the same data, but in a different way. And this is the M40 postcode district where Moston is situated. And we can see here that this number here, these 43, etc., this represents the proportion of the population who are not social grade DE. In other words, they're everything but social grade DE. They would be AB, C1, C2. And as a general rule of thumb, if you have a dark ring around that, just means a high proportion of social rented. And there are some other variables we look at here as well, whether there's a high proportion of private rented and so on. We can see in the Moston area, there's really very little private rented property in this particular patch. We're talking 12, some patches maybe a little bit higher, 15%, etc. So unlike Droylsden, you're getting a lot more like 20s, 22s and that kind of thing. And that's probably a healthy proportion. So for demographics, I'm going to give it a very low score because I think it's just not suitable for buy to let, generally speaking. But As we'll see later, we got to look in the detail because it's very easy to generalize, and that's not always a healthy thing. Now, for crime, we have there's a general rule with crime, which is look at the crime data on a street by street basis, because that gives you a true assessment of what's going on. And to do that, what I've done is I've downloaded all the crime data over a whole year-long period for Manchester. We don't have immediately up-to-date crime, but it's adequate for what we need because it gives us a general sense of what's going on in the area. And you can see here that there's a little patch here with 192 registered crimes, which is incredibly high. And that says that if one was interested in a property in this area, one would just completely avoid, because it's obviously a massively high crime spot. And in a sense, it validates all of these headlines. But the reality with crime is it's important to look at it on a area by area basis, or street by street basis, should I say, and then you go from there. And generally speaking, the way I review areas, if we're looking at real estate and given particular patches or whatever, is that I start with the demographic first and then I work back to the crime. So if we look at this patch here, for example, there should be fairly minimal amount of crime, and so there is a couple of crimes a year. It's very insignificant. You get high street crime, but that's not such an issue. And you can see that there'd be some high street crime here, maybe near a supermarket, exactly. So nothing major there. And you can often get very, very poor areas with very low crime, very rich areas with very high crime. But anyway, since we're giving it overall scores, I'm going to give it a 3 because there's nothing particularly interesting here. It's very isolated crime in little patches. Capital growth is a critical variable for any property deal, and in a sense, it's the variable for me, along with being able to rent the place out, obviously. And to assess capital growth, it's good to start with the long-term story. And we can see here that in the south area, there is capital growth has been very, very strong up here on the northwest, and it hasn't been so good around here. So the question is, what does this mean? Well, the data is capital growth from 2007, inflation adjusted, and by adjusting it for inflation, you get a sense of whether property has done well in real inflation adjusted terms over time. Some areas have done exceptionally well. Down here, for example, 23%, 20% growth. Had you bought in 2007, sold today, you would be 20% richer in real terms. I've done a video all about capital growth, which goes into the whole topic ad nauseum. If you're interested, go and watch that. It's in the description below. Anyhow, it's worth now looking at the 5-year growth and to get a sense of what that's been like. I'm going to hide that area, and now we've got the growth for this whole area here, which is the postcode district, and it's been exceptional. Now, what I think is going on is that you've got areas here, for example, where there's very little housing stock available. The demographic is very weak, and thus the whole area is kind of a no-go for a lot of potential buyers. But if you zoom out and you look at areas like Collyhurst, which are very close to town, still not such good demographic, but some of these peripheral areas in the postcode district have probably done very well because there's probably some excellent value. And you can see up north here, there's quite a lot of interesting demographics, and I suspect capital growth in these little patches. It's quite difficult to zoom right into given areas on capital growth because you need quite a lot of data just to come up with something that's reasonably robust. One property that gets sold for like a block of flats, for example, would be treated as a single transaction, and that would then mess up all the averages everywhere else. So it's quite difficult to get good capital growth data. Suffice to say, short term, this area has been astronomically good. 42% in real terms is remarkable. In the last year, we've seen 11% growth, which is also remarkable. But I just don't think the growth has come from these large tracts of social housing simply because social housing doesn't get resold these days. So councils aren't selling, and therefore you've got to look at all the other property. Okay, on capital growth, I'm going to give it a very high score because I think it is exceptional, and it gets a 4 from me. On sell time, I'm going to just bring that layer up. And again, this is for the whole postcode district. So it's important to remember there are patches where there's just not going to be much activity, and then you've got everywhere else. And on the time to sell, it's 11%. So this is 11% of stock sold per month, which is actually not crazy high. Now, there are some areas where you get like 1% of stock sold per month. Once you factor in completion time and properties which are on sale that are overpriced or in bad locations, this is essentially a seller's market, but not an aggressive seller's market. It's a strong seller market. And for time to rent, 78% rented out per month of stock per month, which is very, very high. And this is definitely a strong renter's market. And it kind of makes sense. Again, proximity to the city centre, more space. And if you find property in a quiet area where there isn't much crime, then Moston is a very attractive place to live. It's all about picking the right spot within the area. And we've seen that with the other crime data. So on time to rent, on time to sell, shall I say, I'm going to give it a 3.5. I think it'll be competitive, but I think you'll get in there and you'll get something. And on time to rent, it gets a 4. So finally, for yield, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of the historic property information we got, and I'm going to show that layer now. Now, the important thing with this information is that it comes from Property Data, who are awesome for this kind of stuff. It's properties that have been on sale, and we get a sense of the yield on them. For example, this one here, it's a semi-detached property, and it's got a 5.9. That was on at 160. And here's another semi-detached 180, 140 for a terrace 2-bed for a modern terrace, and that's 6.1% yield. Yields are good. You've got lots of green space, sensible yields, and depending on the patch, and you can see here, for example, if we look, do you notice how in areas where there's a lot of social housing, there's very little property available, relatively speaking? And that just kind of highlights my point about Moston, that overall it's a very attractive place. You just got to be aware of where you're buying so that you attract the right kind of tenant who wants to live in a quiet area very central to Manchester with lots of green space. On yield, I'm going to give it I'm not going to give it a 4 because it's not absolutely exceptional, but I'll give it a 3.5. And let's see what we got. That is a interesting score. It makes it one of the middle ranges. So let's just open this up. There's some stuff that you see underneath. So I'm going to go Z to A, and we'll just see where it ranks overall. It's not great, and that would kind of figure overall. Okay, I hope that was helpful. All right, that was interesting. I thought Moston might have scored a little higher overall, but I guess because of the terrible demographics and the mediocre crime score. But again, crime, you've got to look at it on a street by street basis to really understand what's going on. It has exceptional capital growth, which is interesting. Would I buy in Moston? Mm, I I don't know. I think the problem with Moston is the reputation supersedes it. However, there are some really interesting patches, and there's probably good value just because a lot of people will be afraid to buy into it because of its reputation. But again, as you saw, there are patches that are very attractive. Anyway, I hope you found that helpful, and until next time, good investing.